Hello, everyone. You're probably very confused to see a stranger at the podium. Welcome to everyone who's here, and also everyone who's viewing online on our live stream in the DeSalle Auditorium YouTube channel. My name is Lila Catelier, and I'm delighted to have joined the museum just this past month, as the Curator of Public Programs. I very much look forward to meeting and hosting all of you in the future. Tonight I have the pleasure of introducing two characters who need absolutely no introduction on this campus. The Cranbrook Art Museum Director, Andrew Blauvelt, and the Curator of Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research, Kevin Adkisson. Together they'll discuss the architecture of Eliel Saarinen as featured in the exhibition Building Cranbrook, Eliel Saarinen in Michigan, featuring the photography of James Hafner, which will become a permanent exhibition here on the lower level of the museum. As well, as we all know, Cranbrook would not be what it is today without the shared vision of Booth and Saarinen. I'm looking forward to hearing from Andrew and Kevin, who both know this wonderful place so deeply. Also here on the lower level is James Hafner's Michigan Modern. We hope you'll take the opportunity to see the stunning documentation of Michigan's legacy of architectural modernism before it closes in early January. James is here tonight. Of course, do not miss the absolutely stunning exhibitions on the main level, Olga D. Amaral's Chuiva Rock and Ali McGee's Banana Moonhorn, which are both on view until March. These works will no doubt warm you on a quiet winter's visit to the campus. Andrew Blauvelt is the director of the Cranbrook Art Museum. Prior to Cranbrook, he served as the senior curator of architecture and design at the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis, where he organized numerous exhibitions, publications, and public programs on the human-built environment, including Parallel Cities, the multi-level metropolis in 2016, with Vincent James and Jennifer Hughes, the first book to offer a trans-historical and trans-cultural survey of elevated pedestrian networks and their impact on cities and their influence on architectural thinking. His curatorial projects at Cranbrook include With Eyes Opened, Cranbrook Academy of Art since 1932, just closing in 2021, which examined the Academy's impact on art, architecture, design, and craft with attention on expanding the canon of artists affiliated with the Academy to include more women, artists of color, and those identifying as LGBTQIA+. He's currently remounting the collections wing with Kat Goffnet, Assistant Curator of Collections, which will reopen for public tours this spring. Curator Kevin Adkisson assists in the presentation, interpretation, and programs across the many buildings and treasures of Cranbrook. A native of North Georgia, Kevin has his BA in architecture from Yale, where he worked in the Yale University Art Gallery's American Decorative Arts and Furniture Study, and an MA from the University of Delaware's Winter Thurr program in American Material Culture, with a thesis examining the role of postmodernism in shopping mall architecture. He previously worked with Robert A.M. Stern Architects in New York as a research and writing associate, and at Kent Bloomer Studio in New Haven, where he designed and fabricated architectural ornament. Kevin joined the Cranbrook Center in 2016 and has been shining a light on Cranbrook's treasures since then. There's one special behind-the-scenes tour of Thornley House with tickets still available tomorrow, Friday, December 3rd at 12:30 p.m. I highly recommend it, and I think there's someone in the audience who could agree with me there. Please join me in welcoming Andrew and Kevin.
Hello. Okay. Whoops. It's a lot. Thank you, Lila, who joined us like last week, actually. She's been put through the ringer to have to introduce her boss. Normally I'd be introducing you, so that's Lila. But thank you very much for the introduction. Thanks to Kevin for agreeing to be our guest. When we originally mounted the exhibition Building Cranbrook, the reason we did that is because we, of course, we're the Cranbrook Art Museum, so people come to us and they come visit us from all over the state and all over the world, and they want to know more about Cranbrook. And we're basically what we call a Kunsthalle, which is we have temporary shows and we change them out frequently. And so you may or may not get something related to Cranbrook because we're a museum of modern contemporary art. So we have been wanting to include images of places around campus, especially those places that you wouldn't maybe normally get in to see unless you're Kevin and have special access and privileges, particularly at Cranbrook Schools and Kingswood School, which are really quite stellar environments. And so knowing James Hefner, who we were going to do the Michigan Modern Photography Exhibition, which I encourage you to see outside in the galleries after this. We decided that this was a really good opportunity, since James has shot so many of the spaces at Cranbrook, to be able to display those images for our guests coming in. And so that's why it's a long-term installation. And we will also be rotating out those images too. So if you come back, you'll see maybe some different kinds of shots of Cranbrook, and hopefully that will spur people to we don't have your cell phone number on the information, thank God. Otherwise, you'll be inundated. But they will contact us about how to do tours and when things can be open, because it is a lot of the spaces are private spaces for school students. So, but you're doing like the Thornley tours, for instance, and that's more open. So thank you very much, Kevin, for joining us.
Of course, happy to be here. And of course, I'm the curator with the Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research, which does provide the access for visitors like you and you at home for coming on special in-person and virtual tours through these spaces that we're going to be discussing tonight.
Exactly, and so when it's talking about building at Cranbrook, then I have to go to Kevin, who's been doing a deep dive since I feel like I should have listened more closely to your introduction since 2012, to be able to really go into a deep dive around the architecture of Cranbrook and the built environment, especially those buildings created by Saarinen, and although not all the campus is created by Saarinen, to be able to talk to somebody with that expertise. And I've been doing the last time here, doing a deep dive into Saarinen's pedagogy. He was the first president of the Academy of Art, and so we did this big project in the summer and this large book. So I was focused mainly on how he taught his students and the progeny of his pedagogical life. So somehow between these two things, we would come together and kind of do a tour through various different topics related to that. But this was an appropriate first slide because this is one of the images that I came across when I was beginning my research many years ago now, which I had not seen before actually, which was this very grandiose scheme for the Academy. So I was hoping that you could give us a tour of what we're looking at here. Some things should look familiar.
Sure. So what's amazing about this drawing, and we tend to use a slightly later version in our publications, this is a drawing that Professor Eliel Saarinen makes at the University of Michigan, and he does this in his architectural studio on the 4th floor of West Engineering Hall. And it's really his first proposal for what would become Cranbrook. And at this point, Eliel Saarinen has had a 25-year career in Finland as an architect, 25 plus. He's celebrated. At the same time, he's perhaps misunderstood by American audiences, and they use sometimes little pedantic phrases like the man of the northern wilds for his earlier Finnish career. And he only teaches at the University of Michigan for a year and change. And this is a drawing he does in Ann Arbor for George and Ellen Booth here at Cranbrook. And so it really is the launch pad, because it's this type of drawing that convinces the Booths to bring Saarinen to Michigan, or to Bloomfield Hills, where he'll have 25 years building at Cranbrook. And so down at the bottom is Lone Pine Road, and here is the Cranbrook House, the Booth family home, the outbuildings like Tower Cottage, the Greek Theater here. I'm pointing to the right-hand side of the screen for those of you at home. And on the left-hand side of the screen, you see this sort of piazza in the front, what would be the Academy of Arts Administration building on the left, and then a really grand formal garden. What will eventually become the Triton Pools is built generally here, but this is just vastly larger than anything Cranbrook would ever build. And so these formal gardens go up to a series of museum halls, a hall of mineral, a hall of mosaics, a hall of cast, a hall of, a really sort of enormously bigger vision of the kind of artistic project George Booth might be funding. And it goes much further inland and much further to the east as well. But I think it shows the sort of scope of planning vision that Eliel Saarinen had, and the sort of ambiguity of what project George and Ellen Booth, the founders, the co-founders of Cranbrook, what they were envisioning. They didn't give their architect, at this point he's not their architect, he's just a sort of a celebrity acquaintance, but it shows that they didn't come to Eliel Saarinen with a sort of, we want 20,000 square feet of studio space, we want 4 departments, we want 6 galleries in the museum. They really didn't know what they wanted, and so Eliel Saarinen was really dreaming here the billion-dollar scheme.
Yes, very Louvre-like, in its ambitions. And there was some interesting, because I'd seen the lower half. I feel like I've seen the lower half, but it was really the upper half that I thought was particularly fascinating in the quadrant, because if I'm reading this right, this looked like gardens. And so one of the things that people don't realize at the Academy of Art was he had imagined it would have the departments basically of what it has today, with a few additions, of course, but that there would be a music conservatory and that there would be a horticulture or landscape architecture program as part of that. And that's what I was wondering, is like, do we see evidence of this kind of broader thinking around the arts?
Yes, it's very much, I think, the way he was thinking about art in Finland, which is really, you can't divorce architecture from music, from painting, from drama, from poetry, and certainly not from landscape. And so there are these sort of floral hemicycle up there at the top left, where you would see a sort of array of greenhouses. And tonight is not one of my slide lectures, so I don't have 16 more images after this one, but it does become slightly more clear what these places are in the architectural models that his wife Loija Saarinen, who had a background in sculpture, when she builds these out, you begin to see like, oh, this is much more formal gardens and a sort of the greenhouses, whereas here it's just looks like someone who really loves columns has made a lot of arcades all around this farmland is where he's proposing this be built.
Right, exactly. Should remind us like fallow farmland, except for they're building, of course, the Booth House. But yeah, but also the integration of the collections too, because you mentioned the Hall of Minerals, and of course those are now at the Institute of Science. And then the art collection. So there was kind of a natural history collection as well as an art collection, and that those things are kind of merged in this scheme, in this kind of grand scheme.
And this plan is interesting to me because Lone Pine Road forms this sort of bottom street across, but what's missing is Christchurch Cranbrook, which would be George Booth's first vision of an art gallery, where he thought he would put paintings in the sides of Christchurch, and then Reverend Dr. Marquis sort of says, this is a church, not an art gallery. And so the paintings end up having to find a new home. But this is so sort of early as to not even have the church proposed down here at all.
Actually, yes, quite.
And so we divided our talk into 7 topics. And the first one is planning. And so this is just one drawing of a proposal at Cranbrook, but Andrew and I selected 6 other plans that give us a broader sense of sort of Eliel's design planning. And so at the top left is his competition entry for the proposed capital at Australia, at Canberra, where he came in 2nd place. That's also, that is the suburbs of Helsinki, Munkkihaga, that I can't possibly pronounce. The top center is Canberra, Australia. On the top right is a proposal for a sort of national hall of fame, a sort of Valhalla of the Finnish culture. And then on the lower left is a plan of the city of Chicago that would have updated Burnham's monumental plan. And so that's Saarinen's revisitation of the Burnham plan. In the bottom center is the plan of Detroit that he did, that George Booth underwrote. And at the lower right is a different version of the Cranbrook plan. So Andrew, draw some conclusions from these 6 plans.
Well, planning was the key element of Saarinen's architectural theories, if not his practice. It was so central, in fact, that really the Department of Architecture that formed here at the Academy was really a department of what we would call town planning at the time, and later we conflate that now with urban planning and city design. But there's so many different ways of interpreting it, because Cranbrook itself, the campus, can be thought of in terms of those planning aspects. It's not a city, but it is a community. And so a lot of what Saarinen's a really interesting figure in this because the planning brings together aspects of materiality, but also he's looking at this almost like a bird would look at this, like the organizational schema of how a town would grow. And so one of the interesting things I think about Saarinen is that he's reading the theories of someone like Camillo Siet, who's an Austrian architect, who is really looking at what we call like the organic evolution of a city. And looking at medieval town plans, for instance. If you've ever been to the old cities of Europe, you would understand kind of what we're talking about. There's an accretion, an accumulation of buildings and spaces that happen over time, but it feels organic in the sense that they are all knitted together. And that would need to be contrasted with something like a more modernist approach to urban planning, which would have been very much like even early, like in the United States with like simple grid systems, for instance. And I know that he always felt like these gridded systems were just too sterile and not as organic. And I know that when you were talking about some of the plans that didn't get built here, or his use of, say, enclosed space, around campus, if you want to talk a little bit about, like, it happens at Kingswood for sure, but here as well.
The art museum is a bit of a thumb sticking out off of Academy Way, and it's really quite lonely, but it's also an unfinished Eliel Saarinen courtyard. And so the collections wing forms one side of it, but that would have been for Saarinen a dining hall, and then he would have come across the Orpheus Fountain with dormitories. And so it's really all about the enclosure of space. And what I notice in looking at these, probably the weakest of these plans, I think, is the bottom left, the plan of Chicago, which, were you to tell me it's just a sort of a student at any Beaux-Arts style architecture school, I'd say, yeah, great. It's a sort of central axis with cross axis. What's more exciting is the sort of other plans where he's repeating these trapezoidal courtyards. And where is he getting that trapezoid from? Camillo Siet, for sure, but also from Venice and the Piazza San Marco, and the sort of spatial effects of doing non-gridded planning, but also the spatial effects of making sure that you are always sort of delineating the interior versus the exterior. And so at the Art Museum, the peristyle, the columns up above us, is a sort of indoor-outdoor space, but it's open landscape on either side. And I don't think he would be particularly happy that it was open, because if you look at the bottom right at this early map of Cranbrook, you see how these are very, this is an extraordinary interior volume, an outdoor interior courtyard where it is fully ringed on all sides. And one of the things that has happened over the years as Cranbrook's landscape has developed and maintenance has changed is we have too many of our sort of interstitial spaces that are asphalted or that are sort of overgrown. And with Saarinen, those were actually critical to understanding this as a little village, that you would come across these intimate courtyards and they would be more like little piazzas, where in Rome you might have a single water fountain as a little bit of a surprise, that you come to the back of the building, but are you back on the front of the building? Was the front just where my car could go, or have I discovered the front on this edge of it? Unfortunately, it is Detroit, and the front is almost always viewed as, what can you see from the car? But really, Cranbrook is this sort of looping system of major minor courtyards with major minor vehicular axes, and then the interiors just continue that language.
Yeah, and the idea of the interiorized courtyard, it's almost like an extension of the architectural space, right? And so the idea that the city, like the proper city design, would be almost read as if you were reading like the blueprint of a house, for instance. So the courtyards that are formed are kind of read in that way, so that there is this blurring of inside and outside. But so important in that is the idea of design. And so, of course, Saarinen is doing all things and trying to create the total work of art. And that's partly his interest in other materials and other scales of design. But if you see that his way of reading the city plan is really to look at it almost in this inverted way. It's almost like the way you would read a blueprint of a house, for instance.
And if you look at the early plans of Cranbrook, you'll notice that the buildings we're not seeing their rooftops, we're not seeing them as just black boxes. We are seeing floor plans. I mean, they're not particularly developed, but he is clearly delineating what are the major rooms within these buildings. And I think it is interesting that he chooses to render most of these city plans as aerial perspectives. He actually thought blueprints were a terrible way at illustrating an architectural idea because it's impossible for us to have a sort of haptic connection to a blueprint. You see a blueprint, and what does it mean to be in that space is a very sort of unmodernist way of understanding architectural drawings. But for him, I think the models were the best way to convey his ideas. And if you don't have a model, well, then you build your building, or you do your drawings, your proposals as these sort of bird's eye perspectives. And this is one of an example of Eliel Saarinen's model work for this grand piazza on the end of Woodward Avenue in Detroit.
Yeah, the models being really important, and so far, and really ahead of his time. And there's a moment where, you know, drawings and elevations and other schematics take over, like the idea of communicating language within modern architecture. But then at a certain point, like sort of almost like in Saarinen's career in the 80s and stuff, this starts becoming, it becomes a communication through modeling. Really is the most effective form, and certainly his son picked that up in grand scheme, and Eliel Saarinen, and are able to sell basically architectural designs through model making in a totally different way than maybe his mother used it, with the use of photography, for instance, and pioneering a lot of the photography, where his mother was very much, as a sculptor, was able to translate literal materials, and the students here as well. So the models have this incredible material quality to them, which I think was so powerful, and why they were so finalists and winners in so many different competitions.
And speaking of materials, what about the materiality of Eliel Saarinen's architecture? And this is a closely cropped photograph from Jim Hafner that's on view outside in the galleries. And this shows my favorite corner of the Cranbrook School for Boys from about 1928. This is the one of the entrances into the dining hall, and you're seeing a combination of the body of the building being built of Detroit common brick, and then this sort of entrance feature made of Roman cut-face brick, limestone, and then leaded glass, as well as the copper gutters, which are actually integral to the construction of the building. So his gutters he would use as part of the concrete formwork for the construction of the building, which is bonkers. And then you have the Ludovici clay tiles from Ohio up above. And I think that this is it's just such a beautiful photograph and a beautiful way of combining materials in a pretty totally original way that the kids call this the Hogwarts dining hall, but I challenge them to find anything Gothic about it. There is just no pointed arch here. He is not looking at any sort of historic form. He's created this kind of symphony of different materials used in a at once very familiar and at once very new way.
Yeah, and I was just thinking about this afternoon. Like, you know, the focus on materiality is so central to his philosophy. So if you go back to Finland in 1900, right, where he's sort of breaking onto the scene or coming onto the scene, and I was thinking, I need to talk to Kevin about this because I can't quite articulate it precisely for you. But there's the idea that the materiality is really the way forward to what would eventually be called like organic design, right? And this is another path within modernism very early on that, you know, gets kind of gets pushed to the side by, you know, the Bauhausian perspective, or the perspectives of Gropius or Le Corbusier. But there is something within the idea of materiality that is so central to this idea of authenticity and truth in materials, like a different, but somehow different than the Bauhaus philosophy. And that's the part I was like, oh, I wish I had Kevin this afternoon to talk about this.
Well, the perplexing thing as we think about materiality in Saarinen's architecture is that he is operating in an era where the Bauhaus is built and the Bauhaus is closing at the same time Cranbrook is being constructed. And so he is very much aware of the critiques of American architecture as being very surface level, as being what some architecture critics would call girder Gothic, which is you build the skyscraper in steel and concrete, and then you wrap it in terracotta or stone in a Gothic style. And Saarinen is aware of these types of critiques. And one response to that could be the Bauhaus. You could use concrete floor plates that are left as raw concrete walls and glass walls with steel frames, and that's the finished product. It's going to crack, it's going to leak, and it's going to be not that good to look at. Or
Depends on your contractor.
depends on your taste. Sometimes you have different taste levels, but Saarinen just floats blithely above this debate by saying, well, my brick buildings are solid brick construction, my stone columns are solid stone construction. And his contractor, Charles Weermuth and Sons, tell him, this is very expensive to do, and the quarries don't want to give you this size of rock. And Saarinen says, well, I believe the quarry has that size of rock. They don't want to cut it for me at that size. And so he sort of is just insistent. He says, no, my stone column will be stone. And so it would have been cheaper, and the contractor would have preferred to put a steel beam straight up, because this roof here is exposed concrete. And so it would have been faster, cheaper to put a steel column, throw up the concrete formwork, and then much later, much closer to the opening of the Kingswood School, to wrap it in a stone sheathing. But Saarinen is just insistent, because then, if that is a stone column, well, then you've just evaded the critics who say you're building a false architecture. The 1930s aren't a time for stone building, because he's just built a solid stone column. And the problems were more than just the quarries not being able to provide the scale of material in these traditional scales. It was also a problem of sequencing, that you just didn't really have stonemasons on site this early in the construction process. And so his insistence that if you have a leaping brick vault onto a concrete column, the bricks actually are doing the labor, you're not sort of doing any sort of fault suspension, it really created additional expense, additional sort of construction documents needed to actually get it built.
Right, which is why we couldn't do the first plan. Ran out of money.
Right, yeah.
We run out of money really quickly. There's so many interesting details too, like this first one on the upper left is, you were describing this to me because I had not thought of this before.
Yes, so this is one of the walls over on Lone Pine Road, and what it is that George Booth, the reason that this farmland in Bloomfield Hills was terrible for farming was that we're at the edge of a moraine, and so at the end of the last ice age, all of these little glacial rocks were pushed forward, and that's what gives us our distinct topography. We're on the same line as Ann Arbor. It's hilly, it's lovely, but there are also rocks everywhere you put a spade. And George Booth, gentleman farmer, insists that he'll be able to farm here. And so as the plows are going through, he is getting all of these rocks, and he uses them to build the stone walls that encircle the campus. So those multicolored granite walls. Saarinen wants to preserve the interior of Cranbrook as a natural reserve. Now, we blow that out of the water with the roads in the 80s, but he pushes all of Cranbrook's buildings to the very edge of the property, and he does this brilliant move where instead of demolishing Booth's wall from 1906 and building his building in its place, he just takes down Booth's wall temporarily and then builds a brick building where he weaves, as if he's using watercolors, brick and granite together. And it's the kind of thing where the masonry is gorgeous, the idea is very poetic, and then the end result, as you drive, which he's very aware you're going to look at these buildings at speed, it's a remarkable sort of flash where you go from stone wall to brick building, without ever a harsh edge, because they simply weave together. It's the kind of awareness of materials and this real respect to materials that you can't quite get sitting at a drafting table every day. It's very much an architect who's out in the field, who has seen construction working, who knows exactly the site he's building on.
And which reminds me of the brick mason, like the bricklayers, that that there's a lovely texture and kind of rhythm to the brick work around the Saarinen campus, and that it's not the rigidity of the kind of perfect brick lane you would expect, the uniformity, the consistent uniformity, but rather the deviations within the brick lane, but kind of the trick of being on the one hand too rigid, on the other hand too messy, right? but somehow you have to negotiate that. And he's not literally laying the bricks. So how does he end up, do you know how he ends up dealing with this?
Charles Vermuth and Sons are the unsung hero of Cranbrook. Those are the contractors who figure out how to do all of this, and their bids are never the cheapest bids, and they are always the bids that are accepted, because I think once they had success at Christ Church, George Booth trusted them, as well he should. And so you end up with walls like at the Art Museum, where those are pretty thick stones, these Mankato Casota blocks. What I love about them is the sort of uniform texture of the Mankato versus the irregularity of the Wyandotte buckskin bricks, which have all these different colors that are coming from the same clay, different firing temperatures. But if you just read that in plan, where you're not delineating the bricks, it would really be a very simple composition. But then in choosing these two materials, it becomes this really rich textile-like facade. Versus the Detroit common brick that the boys' school are made of are actually not quite as fascinating on an individual brick by brick, because mostly they're made to be workhorses. The Wyandottes were made for this sort of jewel effect, and the Wyandotte Brick Company, and they used Cranbrook to advertise all over, and one of their ads said, have you ever seen a brick with a sense of humor? Which I still don't quite get, but I love the copy.
A mind of its own, a brick with a mind of its own, a place of its own, which is really clear in the Art Museum building. I think, the last building he does here on campus, completes in 42. He's in this, we kind of joked that we were going to have this sort of Saturday Night Live, for those who are old enough to remember this, like, is Eliel Saarinen the best architect of the 19th century, or the first architect of the 20th, the first great architect of the 20th century, the last great architect of the 18th century, which is this interesting way of dealing with this idea of all these problems that he's confronting or circumventing around, like, say, the idea of materiality, confronting the modernist doctrine. But then in 42, and what you're saying is completely true. Like, if you're reading the plan, it looks described as austere and everything, but when you're actually looking at it, it's actually very varied and textured and very kind of stimulating in that way.
And Eliel he has a sort of confidence that is just remarkable. To see his sketches, to see that plan from Ann Arbor in 24, and then see the museum being built 15 years later, he really just knows what he's doing, and he kind of seems unquestioning to himself, and it's amazing. I'm not sure that I would know that just from the archives, but also his son Arrow says, I have to work twice as hard and twice as much because I don't have the talent my father did. My father just built buildings and they were brilliant. I have to work and make those buildings. And I think his mastery of materials is part of the reason that his buildings are so successful. One thing that I always am impressed by at the boys' school, in the center top image, those tiny little arches, those are all roofing tiles, and he's used them as bricks, and they actually are supporting the weight of the floor above, which is just kind of like, why did you do that to that poor roofing tile? But what's interesting is that the dimension of a roofing tile and the dimension of a brick are not quite the same. And so his contractor is saying, Eliel, do you want me to break all of these roofing tiles, or do you want the wall slightly thicker? And what's fascinating is that today, in today's architecture, when materials have gotten so thin and buildings are so much about the envelope and then 15 different products protecting us from vapor and moisture, is that Saarinen was really working with real materials and coming up with real challenges to their solution. But it also meant that he could look at a roofing tile and say, I want you to be a brick now. And he didn't have to come up with a sort of company who would make him a superficial tile. There's a sort of elegance to the simplicity of how he puts the materials together that I think you understand it when you're out on the campus and you see the stone and you will look at how he's stacked one on top of the other, how he's added the bullnose to the step. I think it all just, each one of these little decisions is what adds to the feeling that this place is somehow bigger than time itself, is really not going anywhere, and that every decision was the right decision, because it just cumulatively, they all add up until you're just wholly convinced that this is the only way to build this building.
Very good point. So we were, well, we should probably move, to style.
Well, this is where we joked that, and I loved this question. I had not thought of this. Is Eliel Saarinen the last great 19th century architect or the first great 20th century architect? And I think that style inspires that question, because style is such a, it's such a subjective term. It's such a term that becomes a dirty word, a word like beauty to the modernist, where the modernist, well, that's no style, that's true architecture, which is, BS in its own way. But what is the style of Eliel Saarinen's buildings, and what style was he looking for? And we chose this photograph because on the right is this inexplicable stairway entrance that just seems to have no precedent in history. And then on the left is a very charming little arts and crafts dormitory that I think you really could trace back into, if you're doing a lecture on, Tudor revival architecture in America, you wouldn't be wrong to include that at the left. And he sort of weaves them together with an arch that says, "A life without beauty is only half lived." And what is perplexing to me is that I don't think George Booth demanded quotes on this arch, which means that the architect is choosing to add text, to add English text, and a quote from the founder that reads, "A life without beauty is only half lived." And so what style is this building? Who knows? It seems to be so far away from any conversation happening in the 1920s.
Yeah, and that's kind of, I was thinking, well, style, you probably would disagree, like style, I don't do style, and, but then style versus form, right? The search for form. And why that was the driving ethos of the academy was that, why it had to be a contemporary academy, because you had to, as an artist, architect, or designer, you had to respond to the moment, to the time. And that meant trying to find the form that was legitimate to the time when everything else would become a style, the way you're saying, like wrapping the building, like the people he's competing against for, say, the Chicago Tribune Tower and projects like that, where in America it is being read that way, or in Europe it was saying, well, we don't have a style, right? We're the style of the modern, which of course is already a kind of style. But the way that he's able to weave this, because I think you see this all around campus, where one way you look, you would think one way, and then you turn and look at another, and that's kind of the confusion too. Like, well, we can say like, oh, Cranbrook School is like Hogwarts, because it ends up being kind of a kind of amalgam of different symbols: the red brick, the kind of Tudor, revival. There's all elements.
It's associative without being referential, and that's why it's so fun. And it was Geza Morotti who did much of the carving, who said that Cranbrook School was going to be like a great book open to the perfect page. And so it allows you to bring everything that you have in your life, architectural or otherwise, and then project it onto the building. And the lack of any sort of singular style or any direct stylistic reference, but also not relying on pure form, that the materials are rich, that the shapes are rich, the ornament is rich. I think that is what makes them so readable, so infinitely fascinating. It's what makes them so fun to be in all the different seasons, because you see different parts depending on where the light hits and where the tree grows and where the vines grow, all of which he's thinking about.
And the variation within, say, the design, like, so, there's no two doors alike, there's no two windows alike. They all share the same design vocabulary, but the articulation is unique from, say, window to window, which then underscores this idea of customization, almost a kind of luxury in a way that was very different than, say, in the European ethos of like mass production, a kit of parts kind of approach, or a standardization approach, that it was actually the opposite of that, which kind of reinforces, I guess, the whole craft orientation that would have been part of Booth's interest in philosophy. And then I was thinking Kingswood's the same way. It's like it's hard to pinpoint it as any one particular thing. I mean, certainly there's the low-slung horizontality of the entire structure to deal with. There is the specter of right in that, but then it's not fully deco either. So it's operating in this interesting way between all of these different stylistic almost problems.
And Kingswood, which is the lower left of your screen here, when it is published in Architectural Forum, they talk about how bricks were, could any architect build a brick building, and could any architect build a building without style, and that Saarinen had achieved both at Kingswood. And I think that for that writer, a building without style is another way of saying that I just don't know what this style is, and I think that maybe it's great success. And so looking at the screen from the boys' school at the top left to the Saarinen House in the top center, the Arts and Crafts Studios of the Academy at the top right, to the Art Museum on the lower right, and the Institute of Science bottom center, all these buildings are being designed in a very short period of time, and the finances and the sort of need for the buildings are different, but they're not really different enough to lead to this diversity. And Harry Booth, our founder's son, said that the reason they all look different was that his parents wanted each institution to have a personality that was distinctive. And I kind of don't buy that line. I see it as Eliel Saarinen, he's moving to a new country. He's becoming a new citizen. He is becoming a father of 2 children who are becoming significantly more American than he and Loya ever will. And so it is a search for identity and style and what is the proper way of building. I don't know how much he responded to critics and how that influenced him, but it is fascinating to see, the Institute of Science before it is changed significantly. I wanted to say ruined. Before it is altered significantly, the Institute of Science is a sort of Bauhausian Eliel Saarinen that maybe only exist in the Little Fenton Community Center. And then the Art Museum goes back to this sort of grand stripped classicism, this Beaux-Arts art style, and yet they're essentially concurrent. I mean, he's designing them practically at the same time. And so the question of style at Eliel Saarinen is one much more than 8 minutes of discussion could resolve.
True. Reservoir. I was cheating and looking ahead. Oh, well, scales of design, yes. So famously, there's this kind of famous quote, basically, that one should design with the next scale in mind. So that if you designed a chair, you should think about the room that it's going in, and the room should be a reflection of the house, and the house should be a reflection of the neighborhood, and the neighborhood should be a reflection of the city. The kind of ethos that would give impetus to Charles Eames' Powers of 10 film. In a kind of universal way. And then we were trying to, has anyone actually pinpointed that quote? Because it's used so often, and I searched in vain.
I have also searched in vain.
Yes. The closest, his son talks about it.
Yeah. It is Eliel Saarinen's most famously quoted quote, but I can't actually find where Eliel Saarinen ever directly said it or wrote it, but I'm holding out hope that we'll get there. And what's amazing about the Cranbrook as a total work of art, and I think that you can have a total work of art go in sort of like Wagnerian manner, Frank Lloyd Wright, where Frank Lloyd Wright is almost sort of fascist in his level of control, where, it's like, did Mrs. Martin ask for Frank Lloyd Wright to design the dinnerware and the dress that she had to wear to the table that he designed? That he's sitting in his murals in his dining room? I don't know. And what I think is beautiful about the Cranbrook total work of art is that it is collaborative, and that's our next discussion point. So, but as you look at the Saarinen House living room, it really is, Eliel is seeing architecture as the master art. He doesn't distinguish between architecture and interior design. He says that to paint a picture is to make art, to hang a picture is to make architecture. But he himself doesn't see the architect as the necessary being who does every element. The architect coordinates this world, in that if everything is beautiful and harmonious, it can also allow other artisans the opportunity to contribute to that vision. The architect is the sort of conductor of a wider symphony. And on this screen, we just see some of the ways in which Eliel Saarinen is operating in different scales of design, from the cozy corner where you have Studio Loya Saarinen's rugs coming across the bench raya, intersecting with the columns that Pipsan Saarinen Swanson is painting, with Eliel's leaded glass window, with Carl Millis's Head of a Dancing Girl, and then one of my very favorite spots at Cranbrook, where Loya Saarinen's sort of Finnish folk-inspired curtain is being projected upon by Eliel Saarinen's leaded glass window, all of which is dappled through the magnolia tree growing outside in Loya Saarinen's garden, and this sort of like thinking of, well, how big is that tree going to get in relation to my curtain? And then in the top left, the Cranbrook rug #1, the bottom left, Carl Millis's Folkefil Beater at the Art Museum, the crazy baldachin, which was Saarinen's word that Andrew didn't use in the exhibit. And then on the bottom left, the Saarinen family cigarette case, where you pull up the opening of the cigarette case using the smoke from the smoking figure manufactured by Arthur Neville Kirk, Cranbrook's first silversmith. And so you have the Saarinen family and other artisans contributing to this total scale of design.
Most famously, of course, at Kingswood, right? At the request, at the suggestion of Booth, that the family collaborate on that, which is really, I think, one of the masterpieces here at Cranbrook. Although apparently, like the museum the best, but didn't say so. And you knew that they were going to think about the way that the shadow would be projected onto the curtain design, right? That's a sign of an amazing designer, right? They're thinking about the context. They're thinking about the time of day. They're thinking about the season. They're thinking about how something will come to life in real life. Right?
And also the seasons of use. And so Diana Balmori, the great landscape architect who has written extensively about Cranbrook's landscape, she makes the argument that Cranbrook is ultimately an academic landscape, and that Loya Saarinen is choosing flowering trees, shrubs, and annuals that are going to be in flower and bloom from September to June, that the summer is just sort of green at Cranbrook, and all the interest is when the people will be here. Now, what's interesting thinking about the scale is that people like Arthur Neville Kirk, who has a difficult relationship with the Saarinens, he basically says this man should never design silver because he doesn't know how silver works. So there are glimpses of tension between the total work of art vision. But what I'm most impressed by is just that Eliel Saarinen can actually hold all of this in his head, and that for the most part, I say for the most part just to cover my back, but everything he does is great. It's just, he just constantly is cranking out beautiful things, and it's like, how can you at one hand be putting up skyscraper proposals in whole new city plans, and at the other time do really lovely dinner services that are manufactured for the mass market, forks that are just exquisite.
I think it was something you said earlier where, he's really respecting the idea that, like the one person doesn't have to do it all, but they should be knowledgeable about the materials, and they should be able to communicate those things effectively to those that do know. But then, he takes that philosophy when he teaches architecture, that he wants the architects to be exploring all aspects of the academy and all the different disciplines, because somehow throwing a pod or doing a weaving is going to affect the way that you're thinking about how to build and how to construct.
Now, our next topic was collaboration, which is, I think, central to the Cranbrook ethos, and certainly central to the Saarinen efforts. And I don't wonder sometimes as we look at other utopian arts and crafts communities that have come and gone, and then we are all sitting here in 2021 and our sort of utopian arts and crafts community is still happening, if the founding designers of Cranbrook's insistence on collaboration among the family didn't lead to a sense of collaboration everywhere that continues, and it allows you to continue past the death of the founders. And so here we see the Saarinens in Finland. On the far left is Pipsan, their daughter, Loya. Pipsan, of course, is a designer, dressmaker, decorator, accomplished painter and colorist. Loya, sculptor, weaver, gardener. Eliel, who could do it all, and then young Eero, who is a sculptor and architect, and then the Lutheran grandfather, Huho. I don't know if he designed anything. Maybe Eric does.
It could skip a generation.
And then more widely, once they come to Cranbrook, I think we often, and books about Cranbrook often focus on that remarkable foursome, the father, son, and two children. But really, you could not have Cranbrook without the people on this screen and many more, including the contractors, the Viermuths from Fort Wayne, Indiana, of German descent. Of course, George and Ellen Booth, who are not only financing this through the Detroit Evening News fortune, but also editing quite severely. George Booth famously would walk into the drafting studio. He would never say, "I don't like it," but he would say, "Eliel, go back and design something we both like." The Saarinen family, which we see here, Eliel Loya, as well as Florence Knoll and Hans Knoll, Carl and Olga Millis, the Vitrinos, which were a large immigrant Italian family who did all of our landscape gardening for both the Booths and the Saarinens, Pipsan Saarinen and her husband, J. Robert F. Swanson, an architect and designer, and her children, their children. And then here, sort of as placeholders of all the other artisans, the gaggle of Swedish immigrant weavers, Tor Berglund, the cabinet maker, Maya Anderson Virda, and Lillian Holm, and two unknown Swedish weavers.
So important to the whole production of everything. The collaborative effort translates too into the Academy via the Booths, actually, who go on a trip to Europe, to Italy, and witness the American Academy in Rome, which at that point was doing a lot of projects centered around collaboration, and that was one of the light bulbs, shall we say, to the idea of having an academy. That's why they use the word academy, the Cranbrook Academy of Art, that it would be a collaborative atmosphere, and that's something that, of course, Eliel, masterminds to a great effect, is that he'll bring the teams together to do competitions, and that way, because you would have a natural rivalry within any sort of class or department, but he kind of gets them to work together to compete against other schools and other teams, and kind of does a beautiful job of that. And so many friendships were made, and then they became so prolific because of that philosophy.
And I think, these are sort of builders of Cranbrook, each of whom bring skill sets largely from Europe, and Cranbrook did take heat, most famously from Frank Lloyd Wright, who basically, said George Booth has no faith in America, and that's why there are no Americans working at Cranbrook. I don't think that was true. I think actually Cranbrook was a sort of vision of American possibility, that all these people who, back in Europe, if you look at their work, it is much more sort of regional. It's much more sort of centered in their own histories and their own iterations of the arts and crafts. And then here at Cranbrook, under Eliel's direction, each one of them begins producing in a new collaborative way. And with the artist on screen, less so with the students, but each of these people are bringing an enormous amount of old world traditional skills and handicraft that really, especially in the case of the weavers, there was no one in America who could do this stuff. And so Cranbrook ends up being singular because the people who came to work at Cranbrook were singular.
Exactly, and some of them saw the kind of freedom that they might find here in America too, without the burden of, so they said, the history, that the despised kind of Beaux-Arts tradition that Saarinen rejected, could be a kind of new, kind of almost tabula rasa here in America.
Which I think also goes to the sense of philosophy.
This is our last one.
It is our last one, and then we'll take questions. So start writing them down out there.
Well, yes. Well, in doing the research for the show this summer in the book, well, it's 7 years of research, but coming to the appreciation that Eliel Saarinen is a contemporary thinker, and we have to juxtapose the idea of being modern versus the idea of being contemporary, almost like we do in art history. That the modern, let's say that's 20th century, this is the early 20th century thinking, that there's a dogma and a thesis that modernism itself is universal and unchanging and always right, versus this idea that the search for form would be a contemporary exploration, meaning that the times of today, the art of today, of now, would need to be contended with and dealt with each successive new generation of artists and designers and architects. And that was kind of one of my key takeaways of his brilliance, and also the fact of flexibility. Like he was very practical as an architect, I would say. Like he was always trying to solve these problems, of course doing them in the most beautiful and materially rich way. But that pragmatism was not ever dogmatic. It was really thinking about, like within a building or within a town design, you couldn't really, he rejected those ideas like this is the city of the future, or Corbusier's, Ville Radius, that those schemes were doomed to fail from the very beginning because they were totalized systems that tried to project what the future could be, which we do not know. So the best thing that we could do is lay the solid foundation for those people to have to contend with that in terms of the city, laying some foundation so that people can react to that, so that it can be organic and so that it can develop over time in a kind of beautiful way. And here we have the Academy.
and so I think, we've been talking mostly about the buildings of Cranbrook, including all of the 6 Cranbrook institutions, or the 4 that Eliel Saarinen designs. But I think it is kind of amazing. I spent a lot of time with our work at the Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research, thinking about Cranbrook history and thinking about how it got put together and what is physically here, sharing what is here. And I spend less time about sort of what's happening in the studio, but ultimately that is the reason that we exist. And Eliel Saarinen isn't just putting blocks together. He isn't just making these buildings. They are then filled with students who are given the opportunity and the encouragement by Eliel Saarinen to work across many different disciplines and to use this campus as a laboratory. And I think that's one of the most remarkable features of him as an educator, is that, first of all, he demanded you be an expert. He did not want, 22-year-olds right out of undergrads. I think David Friedenthal is the only high schooler who ever comes to Cranbrook straight here. He wanted experts, and then as soon as you got here with all your expertise, he would tell you, well, go learn how to weave. And so there's this sort of, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's this sense that he wants people who are really, really good, and then as soon as they get here, okay, he knows you're really good at designing a building or really good at throwing pots, so you're probably going to be really good at this other discipline, and that will give you the sort of universal respect to go forth wherever you end up, being more confident in your abilities and being more confident in the sort of allied arts, as art being not something where you get squirreled away in a Paris attic painting for the rest of your life, but that, well, I once knew how to paint at Cranbrook, and therefore I'm going to respect the painters more. I can do more. I think it's a very optimistic view of art.
I think you identified the secret sauce to the Academy's success. It opens in 1932. By 1939, within not even a decade, it was already identified as one of the leading art schools in the world. And how did that happen? Well, they were very selective about who could enter the Academy, but he was looking, and I also have my own theory that Reisman was actually who was like the kind of, I think he had the title of secretary, but I think he would be kind of more like a registrar today, enrolling students. But he was scouting, so they had a network of people scouting young talent across the country. And so you could get a Charles Eames who was doing like, architecture, but he knew how to build a building, but he would come here and then suddenly go off on the exploration of design and become one of the most important, if not the most important designer, product designer, and the furniture designer in the 20th century. You have that with Ray Kaiser, his future wife, who was already established as an abstract painter, comes here in the weaving department, right, not the painting department, but ends up spending most of her time in the design studio, the new fledgling design studio. You also have a lot of blurring, too, between these roles, which was really progressive at the time, if you think about it. So Bertoya comes here to study metalsmithing, and Eames comes to study essentially architecture, but they actually become, within, say, like a year, the heads of those new departments. And that's kind of incredible, and they could only do that by having a solid foundation and a real, drive to say, like, here's the exploration that needs to happen next. So there was this fervent belief that the next generation, the youngest, that everything was antiquated in terms of the terminology, like who's a student and who's a teacher. It's like everyone's a student or everyone's a teacher, right, depending on the circumstance. And those things were really exciting to find because they are so contemporary in the philosophy.
And I think that's why when the bureaucracy of Cranbrook must get larger to become accredited, to get federal funding, and you get all these sort of horrors of the modern institution, and Eliel Saarinen just says, okay, well, I'm not going to be president. I don't want to be here. And so he steps down 8 years before his passing without really changing any of his sort of duties, because in those early this Eliel is coordinating it, but certainly not directing it in any way that the government coming in saying, why are we paying you to have students here, would identify as a school in any semblance. And so you end up with sort of changes to the operation that Eliel Saarinen just is not that interested in.
Right. I think Lillian Saarinen had a really great quote that she thought that Eliel was really delighted, towards the end of his life, thinking back on what he had created before it became kind of, bureaucratized, became just an art school or another art school, that it was this great big barn. And that's how she described it. And there would be people doing different things in different parts of the barn, and that you were supposed to all participate in this environment, in this intensely creative environment. And that's holds the keys to a lot of the making traditions here, that, when the students have crits, you actually have to have art to show. Like, you go to some art schools, you hear people talking a lot. They're just talking about ideas and stuff. Here, you couldn't get away with that. You really had to produce something, you had to make it, because the evidence was in the proof of the product, and that's also why we have the degree show at the museum every year, because Saarinen's dictate was, here's your studio, we're not going to tell you what to do, there's no curriculum. So this is really terrifying, right? I mean, if you're an artist, maybe it's liberating for some people. For a lot of the students, it was terrifying. And his dictate was, you're going to have a show in May, it better be good, because the public's coming. So get busy. And I just kind of love that kind of, he's like really basic. We're just going to lay it all out for you here.
And I think my last point before we go to questions, a lot of schools of art, a lot of architecture, you look at the Bauhaus, that's Walter Gropius's architectural vision, or Paul Rudolph at Yale, the Art and Architecture building, it's Rudolph's vision of what an art studio should be. And they're very rigid. They tell you exactly what function is what room, and exactly what the perfect version of the building would be, which is empty. And Saarinen instead gives this very eclectic series of buildings that Academy Way is probably not what anyone wants the postcard of, partly because it's just hard to photograph, but it is this sort of humble yet insistently quality architecture that I think is just this sort of, I view it as this sort of friendly, omnipresent hand over the students, just being like, here is excellent. This brick wall is not going to fall down. This building is going to hold whatever you do. Now make excellent things inside of it. And here is a smattering of rooms of all different shapes, sizes, and dimensions for you to explore in. So it's not a neutral architecture, but nor is it an architecture that sort of screams at the students as to what art and architecture could be, should be.
Kind of like a reflection of himself, I think, ultimately, yeah.
He also just was really funny and friendly, and I love that, because not everyone in the history of Cranbrook is, and I like that he had jokes.
And he had martinis at 5 o'clock.
And he had strawberry blonde hair, so.
And we picked up that tradition in the 80s by having martinis at 5 o'clock in the design department. Thank you.
If you raise your hand, I'll bring the microphone to you so that the audience online can hear your question. I'd love to start by asking you about delight, because I didn't hear that word very often in what you were talking about, and I really think that there's so much delight in this campus, and I would actually argue that that might be the style. Can you just spend 2 seconds on thinking about that?
Yeah.
Well, in all my tours of Saarinen House, I say that as Eliel is designing at each scale, he also is sort of insistent that every scale shift has a moment of surprise and delight. And so that's how you get the peacocks that appear on the interior of the cabinetry, or the little roses that are embroidered into the bathroom rug. I mean, I do think that beauty, delight, surprise, joy, these are all really intangible architectural qualities that were very important to Eliel Saarinen and to his design. Even humor is in there.
Yeah, I would concur that the idea of like turning a corner and there's a surprise, but it's actually delightful. Or the scale is delightful, or the use of materials is delightful. It's always that condition, but it's that emotional condition, which again puts him in a very contemporary sensibility and outside of all of his peers, I would say, those Bauhaus peers, that allows him to have that the humanness, and that's part of the organic design tradition too that comes through.
There aren't too many architects I can envision getting their paint set out and painting a little dancing girl, Kitty Kingswood, just because a drain pipe was put in the wrong spot. And instead of demanding the contractor somehow fix it architecturally, say, oh, well, in that drain pipe, I see a little dancing girl, and just paint Kitty Kingswood, the school mascot.
My question is about the future and the future buildings, or since Saarinen, adding of the Kingswood campus and the pool and things like that. Did he leave any, pre-plans? I mean, because some of the things are different from his original plan. Did he leave any ideas about, we could put more dorms over here, or we could put this over here? Anything for expansion?
Yes, around here I know, because the museum has an indication, or I read it as an indication, I don't know if you agree, that there's almost like a knockout panel that would suggest a connection to an expansion of the museum, probably thinking that, like most museums, the collections expand, they keep growing. But you had also mentioned too that the collections wing was located in the area where he wanted to create more of an enclosure, and I think that's what the Smith Group locked onto when they suggested that building position.
And I think that Cranbrook was wise in the 80s and 90s to not try and do Saarinen revival, to not do postmodern Saarinen. It's why Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown were ultimately not chosen to do an addition, because one of the jury members said, Venturi Scott Brown's brilliance is in reinterpreting history in places that don't have it. And Cranbrook doesn't need that because we have the real deal. And so in our Millennium projects under Dr. Lillian Bowder, president of CEC, we really got great architecture, if not always as delightful as Saarinen's, but we got architects who thought at all different scales. I think some of our more contemporary buildings have lost that in a correct search for budget friendliness. But Saarinen himself never sort of late in life, age 74, said, we shall expand in all these directions. So we're sort of basing ourselves off of the beauty of what he gave us and not wanting to mess it up.
Yeah, I think I often joke that I don't know how many conversations I had about value engineering building the original Cranbrook campus. But one of my favorite additions is actually the Auditorium by Todd Williams, who didn't study here at the academy, but studied at the Cranbrook schools. And Todd and Billy have a really great sensibility around materials and materiality among contemporary architects. And I think, and the sense of placement, being familiar with the campus, I think that's one of my more favorite additions to the campus. Whereas some other ones I think are challenged still. I think that they represent a kind of challenge or a weakness, I have to say.
That's our debate for next Thursday night. Other questions?
So the first slide had structures and gardens south of Lone Pine. Did Cranbrook own that?
Cranbrook did, and it still does. And so this is the parking lot, the 500 lot. We own that, and we also own the strip of land in the field in front of Christ Church. So that the church doesn't own that. George Booth at the time owned all of it, and then he and his brother Ralph helped to develop it. And so there's a little Booth-built spec home in the neighborhood that's quite remarkable. So yes, Booth at different times owned different things. Amazingly, when Saarinen plans the boys' school, he draws the football field on property Booth did not own. And Booth sort of says, well, when I grew up, we played sports just in fields. It's fine. And then he sort of realizes, I guess we'll want to play other high schools and get glory through sports. And he starts buying up the neighborhood next to it to actually be able to fit Saarinen's blueprint on the ground.
Got it. Okay, thanks.
I did once ask those neighbors if they minded not having a front door, because there's a house behind that parking lot with no way to get to a street, and they said, we love the privacy. I said, okay.
We had a question here in the front.
Okay, thank you. It seems like, from what you said, that Saarinen was kind of thumbing his nose at, what the architecture was at that time. Mm-hmm. So I actually kind of have a two-part question. What did the critics say, of the buildings that he built here? And also, You mentioned, was he the greatest architect of the 19th century or of the 20th century? So I want to know what you two think, you know, if he's the 19th or the 20th century greatest architect.
Great question. The critical response to Cranbrook is, in my reading, and I feel like I've been through the magazines multiple times, pretty universally positive. The critical response is very often tied up in the generosity of the booths, and that is something that perhaps in today's architectural criticism you wouldn't see as much. It would be like, oh, you know, so-and-so foundation has made this possible. And it was a very often sort of the luxurious feel of the whole enterprise is the generosity, this act of Christian charity of George and Ellen Booth, and the quality of the place. Famously, I think it was Life or Time magazine says, George Booth is America's Medici and Carl Millis his Bernini, his sculptor. So the press is, in my experience, positive and almost as much focused on the beauty and the miraculousness of its creation as on the sort of evaluating the buildings block by block. What's interesting is that critics into the 20th century continue to love Cranbrook as Cranbrook becomes disappeared from architecture history. So people like Edelise Huxtable will always admire Eliel Saarinen. James Sterling is another one who he whips Eliel Saarinen out all the time, and he sort of says, you know, Arrow is fine, but Eliel's where it's at. And so you have these architects who are trying to pull focus back to Eliel, and yet he disappears from architecture history for decades. To the extent that in the 70s, I'm not sure anyone at Cranbrook was thinking about Eliel Saarinen. It was just, well, these are our buildings and they're lovely. So the critical response is positive and then disappears.
Kind of like his son Arrow disappears too within architectural history and criticism, but then comes back, and it has, I think it has a lot to do with the sort of dogmatic kind of waves that go through architecture and what's sort of in vogue and not, and the kind of purism that accompanies that, like, you know, if you're not pure, then you're not part of the canon or whatever. And so, and that's kind of what we've been talking about, how it is impure, and that's the kind of ethos that they're trying to weave through their buildings and through their pedagogy. And so I'm biding time to answer your question. So I think I would say over time, when I was a student here in the design department, and at that time, I think we felt like, well, Eliel Saarinen was the last great architect of the 19th century, but now, after doing all of this research and being here for much longer than when I was a student, I think that he's the first great architect of the 20th century.
I think part of his critical disappearance is that it is befuddling to love something and have something that challenges every architectural belief that you hold dear. And so if you are a critic of modernist architecture, or if you are a firm believer in the sort of purity of a zeitgeist, of a spirit of the age, of an ever forward-forcing art world, and then you come here and you like it, that challenges you because it's not the right time period, it's not, you know, it's not pure. And so then, well, you just ignore it. You know, send your friends over to see it, but don't talk about it. You know, I'm someone who came to the campus through Eliel Saarinen, through living in his dormitories, and loving Eliel Saarinen well before I ever lived in any of his buildings or saw them. And so I just remember the sort of joy of learning more about Eliel. I'm not sure that I ever had an earlier conception of him, other than just you look at the date and you look at what else is happening and you get very confused because it's just like these things do not line up with where I think they should on the timeline of architecture, but why don't they? I would also make the argument that he is the first great architect of the 20th century. I also think he's the first great European architect to come to America and to transform modern architecture, transform the future of American building and the future of international building by shifting the center for the first time from Europe to America. And Eliel is who is doing it first. He is the first one to come over, and he then becomes the first great modern architect of the 20th century.
And that idea is transmitted by, you know, his son Arrow and Charles Eames when they're students here doing the furniture. That is a seismic shift when they win the MoMA competition in the 1940s, partly because of the war in Europe, but the center shifts to the United States at that moment. I'm not quite sure when it returned to Europe, and some people debate whether it's even returned back to the United States, but that's an echo of that. So I would totally agree that Eliel is the first kind of instance of this transmittal from Europe, and in a very interesting way, and I would say in a particularly American way, where they're taking on influences from another place, but then making it their own and using the circumstance and the opportunities in this country in order to do that.
And as we wrap up, if you want to hear me talk more and more about the circle of Eliel and Aras Saarinen, this January I'll start my 5th annual History of American Architecture lecture series, which is going to be focused on Aras Saarinen and his circle of architects, designers, and critics, and sort of looking at the broader architectural scene through the lens of Aras Saarinen.
Is Robert Venturi going to play a big role?
Of course, of course. Jerry Kavanaugh, we'll get them all.
Oh, good.
Eliel Saarinen, you know.
Oh, good.
Thank you so much, Kevin and Andrew.
Thank y'all.
Thank you, everyone.